If you could talk about the dud rate. There seems to be some questions about how the U.S. knows that its own munitions that will be provided will have such a low dud rate, and how have you been able to assure allies that these munitions won't cause excessive civilian harm? And then secondly, is the primary reason that the cluster munitions are being used now because there is so much strain on the 155 millimeter pile?
Yeah, those are important questions. So look, we're aware of reporting, and I've seen some things in the press over the last 24 hours, that references various DoD studies which analyze the dud rates of older versions of DPICMs. There are lots of different variants. I think as we talked about, the Russians are, a cluster munition is not a cluster munition. There are big differences between them. Many of those studies that have been referenced, at least the ones that I've seen in the press, were based on testing completed in the 1980s, and many of the DPICMs of those variants have since been demilitarized. We're not providing those variants of DPICMs to Ukraine. Instead, we'll be providing our most modern DPICMs with dud rates assessed to be under 2.35%, demonstrated through 5 comprehensive tests conducted by the Department of Defense between 1998 and 2020. So we're confident in those numbers. I will also say how they're used matters.
On the cluster munition, you mentioned 5 studies since 1998 until 2020 that prove you have in your stockpile the dud rate lower than 2.35. Is the department willing to make these studies available so experts can verify the accuracy of the data? Second one, in terms of providing cluster munition, is this administration breaking the law passed by the Congress that prohibits the transfer of cluster munition that is with the level above 1%? And finally, on Russia, we've seen 2 incidents lately in Syria where Russian aircraft, according to the Pentagon, harassed U.S. drones. Before that, we saw something happening similarly in the Black Sea. Are you concerned that Russia is kind of normalizing this behavior, and is the DoD willing to take any actions to prevent Russia from continuing this type of behavior? Thank you.
Sure. So a bunch of things there. On the test itself, I think at this juncture, because the tests themselves are classified, we won't be releasing them, but we'll take that question back. Presently, those tests, those reports are classified. I can say this: we have high confidence in those numbers based on 5 consecutive tests. I also have high confidence that they will be far more efficient and discriminate than the cluster munitions that the Russians are using. And I think the Ukrainian assurances on top of that give me added confidence in that. I'll also say that it's not a good thing for civilians in Ukraine or the humanitarian situation in Ukraine for Ukraine's counteroffensive to be unsuccessful or for the Russians to be more successful. That seems like a recipe for more humanitarian suffering. So to the degree that there's a utilitarian calculus in this, I think it's worth thinking that through. And I think that's ultimately why, even though this is a decision that the administration deliberated on and that the president thought very carefully about, there was no disagreement among the president's principal advisors on whether we should provide this system, and that includes across the departments, not just the Department of Defense. Are we breaking the law? We are not breaking the law. I would say, first of all, the prohibition against exporting above 1%, these munitions are pretty close to 1%, but they're not at the 1% level. But the president does have the authority to waive that requirement on national security grounds, and that's what he has done in this instance. There's no dispute that he has that authority. It's in law. But we also didn't make this as a unilateral decision. We've been having conversations with, informal conversations for weeks with the Hill. I'm sure many of you have had your own conversations with members on both sides of the aisle on the Hill. This is obviously a capability that the Ukrainians have been asking for a while, and we continued those consultations with the Hill and escalated them as we got closer to this decision. So doesn't mean everybody in Congress will agree, but I think everybody will agree that it was within the right of the president to do this